Good evening, welcome. I'm Jessica Morgan, I'm the director here at Dia Art Foundation. I'm so happy to see so many of you with us on this rather rainy, cold night. This is like a family affair. Fred Sandback's history with Dia actually predates Dia. In fact, we were founded in 1974, but he had an exhibition in 1968 with one of our three founders, Heiner Friedrich, who of course had a gallery in Munich before he came here to New York to establish Dia with our co-founders, Helen Fostick and Philippa de Menil. So I would say it's been a very long journey, a very wonderful long journey. Of course, I sadly was not around for the many years of the Fred Sandback Museum in Winchendon, Massachusetts. And in fact, as director of Dia, I would say it's one of those things you learn about, maybe a few weeks or months in. You're like, there was a Fred Sandback Museum in Winchendon, Massachusetts? What is this? It used to happen to me every week, and now I feel like it's more like every year some new discovery about Dia appears. But this one, I have to say, truly fascinated me. And despite the fact that I was never able to see it, I've pored over the images, and I'm also, of course, incredibly happy that we now have this book that really memorializes this incredible period. And hopefully gives access to it for so many other people like me who are not able to be there. I was, however, here in New York in 1996, I have to check my notes, when the exhibition of Fred's work was at Dia Center for the Arts, what used to be Dia across the street in our old space. And it was nothing short of an extraordinarily memorable experience. Growing up in the UK, I was not aware of Fred Sandback's work and could not believe that you could achieve this sort of miracle of plane and line and space through taut yarn. So it has stayed with me in a very vivid way for so many years after. Of course, up at Dia Beacon, we've been incredibly fortunate to have on view for many of the years that we've been open, since 2003, a display of works that Fred Sandback himself installed in our galleries with Curtis, who actually made the musical selection that you were listening to a moment ago. A series of installations that really articulate the space and the architecture. In fact, I was reminded the other day of the words of Len Riggio, who was one of our former heads of board and a great lover of Fred Sandback's work, who said to me that he felt like the Sandbacks were actually holding up the building, that this tautness was sort of providing the structure of the architecture, which I think is such a beautiful way to think about those works. So, as I said, this is very much a family affair. It's been a long and beautiful journey, and I think we're so fortunate to have this publication that we're celebrating tonight. So thank you everyone who's been involved in it. Interaction, the 50 Years of Fred Sandback and Dia Art Foundation, was edited by Karen Kelly and Barbara Schroeder. There are contributions by Umberto Morrow, our deputy director, who will be taking the stage in a moment to moderate the conversation. Lynn Cook, who is our former curator, who of course worked closely with Fred Sandback over the years. Julian Rose, Corinna Thierolf, Edward Vazquez, who's of course with us tonight. Matilde Guidelli-Guidi, who is both our curator and co-director of our curatorial department. And Curtis Harvey, who is the person who makes all the magic happen up in Dia Beacon when kids run into the Sandbacks and they ping. Curtis is there to magically bring them back to life. So it's my pleasure to thank everyone, but also to introduce our guests who are here this evening who do not work at Dia. So Edward Vazquez, who's a professor at the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Middlesbrough College in Vermont, and is a scholar of the art of late modernism, and is currently working on a fascinating sounding book on the Chilean art of the late 1970s and early 1980s. Eddie has previously written on Sandback, and is the author of Aspects, Fred Sandback's Sculpture by University of Chicago Press, that was published in 2017. His work has been supported by many grants and fellowships, including the Center for Advanced Studies in Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art, and the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, and the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grants, among many others. Julian Rose is a designer, critic, and historian, and from 2012 to 2018, he was senior editor at Art Forum. He regularly contributes to a wide range of publications, including Aperture, Architectural Record, Architectural Review, Art Forum, and October. And he's co-founder of the design studio Formless Finder, who've been exhibited internationally at venues such as MoMA, the Chicago Architectural Biennial, and the Venice Biennale of Architecture. His latest book, Building Culture, explores the architecture of art museums and was released by Princeton Architecture Press in 2024. So I welcome everyone to the stage. Thank you for being here. And Amy, thank you always for our very long history together. And thank you, David, as well, of course. It's a pleasure working with you always and into the future.
I'm Umberto Moro. I'm Deputy Director of Program here at the Art Foundation. And it's truly my absolute honor to welcome you to this book launch of Interaction, 50 Years of Fred Sandback and Dia Art Foundation. Dia has been closely collaborating with the Fred Sandback Archive and with Amy for years now in the production of this exciting publication that we're presenting today. And Jessica made my life so easy because she covers so much ground that I will have to skip now. That's great. And I want to start by thanking Amy Sandback, whose unwavering support has really solidified this project over the years, as well as David Gray, who is the voice of reason at all times in this process and other processes. And of course, thank you to the authors, some of whom are here, but we have Corinna Thierolf and Lynn Cook and Curtis Harvey, as Jessica mentioned, who are not with us today. Obviously, Karen and Barbara from Dancing Foxes, who have made an incredible object, and our colleagues here at DIA, Camilla Foreman, who's Director of Publications, and Jessica, of course, who were very closely related to this project. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Sandback family. Some members are here tonight, so thank you for joining us, and some friends, Amabong, who have been part of the history of Fred's work for many, many years, so it does really feel like a family affair. And of course, our wonderful team at DIA, Kim Golding and Max Tanon, who make all public programs happen here at DIA, so thank you. And I'll get us started to think about what we're doing here today, just thinking about how we're celebrating this relationship who has quietly shaped the art world over many, many decades. And Interaction really sort of like honors this dialogue between an artist and an institution. And it marks 20 years since Sandback's installation opened at Dia Beacon, as Jessica indicated earlier. And you know, there's a long and rich history of Sandback and Dia, which predates our institution through the many shows that I was kind of like going through the shows, and basically Fred had shows with Heiner, Friedrich almost every year after 1968, and in different cities like Munich, Cologne, New York City, and that really showed the level of interaction and the depth of the conversation that translated into Dia. And that is really when Dia came in the picture for Fred, where he was thinking about permanence and continuity and how to extend that into the future. Fred Sandback's work was never about representation, and like many artists of his time, he was pushing back against the legacy of abstract expressionism and searching for something less heroic, less gestural, more experiential. And he discovered the power of variation within limits, working with yarn and space, light and line. His sculptures don't fill a room, they reframe it. They don't occupy space, they create situations within it. Many artists and thinkers have described this quality in different ways. Some of them have been very foundational to Dia. Dan Flavin, for instance, called it situational. Robert Irwin called it conditional. And in this book, we use terms like site-aware or context-dependent. But whatever the language or the nomenclature is, the point is that the artwork only exists in the here and now, and with you, the viewer, completing it. Now, thinking about the book, this beautiful object that we have with us today and its contents, it brings together a chorus of voices, friends, scholars, curators, each offering a unique reflection on Sandback's work and legacy and his relationship to Dia. And today we will hear from Eddie, Julian, and Matilde. Eddie's scholarship, which has been foundational to Sandback. He has previously wrote about Sandback, more specifically in his book titled Aspects, where he clarifies that the first time he discovered Fred's work was at Dia Beacon in 2003, which is something I'll come back to. But his essay, I think, really explores this idea of institutional complexities and that space and the unique way in which the boundaries between the public and private life of an artist are blurred. Julian, on his side, really explores how Sandback work has transformed architecture. And, in Jessica's remark, she was thinking about how the work really affects architecture, sort of like subverting it, and that what the meaning of it has for us in both cultural space, but also outside of them. Julian is really thinking about refusal and how refusal really subverts the binary between drawing and sculpture, space and form, material and void. And his close look at Sandback's use of isometric drawing, he ties it to larger questions about the white cube and the nature of the studio in today's world. Matilde, who's our wonderful curator and co-department head here at Dia, was in conversation with Curtis Harvey, who's our director of exhibitions in Beacon, and their dialogue really focuses on Dia's long-term support of artists like Sandback, who weren't easily categorized or commercialized, and how this gave rise to the idea of the single artist museum. They also speak about the unique understanding of space and how simple materials like yarn and really transform moments of tranquility and shared knowledge between artwork and viewer. So today, just to say a little bit of what we will do, I prompted the authors to speak about their own contributions with short presentations, which we will do, and then we'll engage in some questions both between us and with you, hopefully. So yeah, I'll get us started with Eddie.
I have some notes that are some quotations, mostly of Fred's, and as Umberto mentioned, and as Julie and I were speaking about a minute ago, I think for a whole generation of people, Beacon was where we came into contact with Fred's work. I went there in 2003, shortly after Beacon opened, before I went to graduate school, and was just blown away by the work. And Fred once said that his work is about any number of things, but being in a place is right up there on the list. And while Dia didn't allow for all the places that became Fred's spaces and work, they allowed for many. And I think they created a space for me to see the work as well and to begin to be fascinated by it. What I wanted to do in the time that I have is to press on one word that I thought about a lot when writing my text and thinking about it, which is coalescence, which is a word that Fred used a few times in texts, and I think it speaks both to material understanding of his work, but also to the kind of like social aspiration of elements of his practice. So coalescence, per the OED, is the union, merging, or combination of different persons, parties, principles, interests, etc., into one. The union into one mass or body, an amalgamation or fusion. And the way that I want to spin that, I guess, is to think both about origin points. And so this is the untitled floor piece that is the sort of object that sometimes gets spoken about, and I'll leave the complexities of the 2x4 aside for now for others to address. But you know, and the black and white photograph, which I believe a color one exists now, but this is from Fred's studio in New Haven, and then on the the color photograph on the ground is a photograph that I took in Liechtenstein, in Vaduz, that Amavang no doubt had a hand in, and where Amy and David and I first met in 2005. But this work, per Fred, allowed him to play with something existing and not existing at the same time. And I think that there's a way that there's a material coalescence there between the drift of the frame and armature and the expanded space around it, right? That allows us to sort of read this collision of lines as a integral form, right? And I think that notion of a kind of like coalescing into was, I think, a singular and important insight for Fred's early work that then expands and moves out to some of the work that I first saw at Dia Beacon in 2003 that I think offers a much more architecturally ensnaring way of thinking through these issues of coalescence. And Umberto, you mentioned situations, right? And I think that a lot of what's happening in the move from this kind of like discrete objecthood in response to minimal sculpture and a variety of other precedents out into this more diaphanous and diffuse and architecturally scaled linearity is a coalescence that is less about the singular objecthood and more about the situational expanse, as you say. So if Fred would say about the floor piece, it was unavoidable to perceive that the sculptures didn't stop where the lines did, and that the situation had gotten more complex. And of his more broader work, as it got bigger, he could say, you know, the materiality of the situation I am involved in is of a major concern to me. But my manipulated material is simply a small part of that. There are empty spaces between the lines, and they're no less real or material than the lines themselves. And I think that we can get caught up in the sort of formal trick of the sort of like dissolving and materializing of space, the way that these things become sort of tangible and intangible. And yet, to me, I read this as a way of understanding a kind of like social experience of selfhood, right? It's like, where do I begin and end relative to my relationship to others? Like, how close do I have to sit to you, Umberto, before it starts to feel awkward, you know? And I think that there's something here about like, where does the sculpture begin and end that is about where I begin and end, and how much do I draw on the world around me to constitute myself? And I think that, you know, I think kids' responses to this work are really instructive in terms of playing with that. I also think, particularly in a work like the one from Dia, where you have the perpendicular construction of the work, is that you end up with one opening and another closing that also suggests that from any fixed vantage point, there is also the inability to see something else in its wholeness. So there's almost like a, I don't know, like a Glissantian opacity that's at the core of something like this that is also so open and accessible. I see this also in the Sandback Museum. And so what I wrote about in the book is a little bit about the Fred Sandback Museum and the studio both in Winchendon and in New Hampshire. And this is an institution that was undertaken with Dia's support and patronage. It ran from 1981 to 1996. And I think that there are two things about the museum that I want to stress. There's integration and disintegration as they stand in relationship to time. And if Fred would say, and this is where I come to coalescence, he said, my intrusions are usually modest, perhaps because it seems like it's the first moment when things start to coalesce that is interesting. Then one motivation for the museum was that as the work got larger and larger and larger and more permutational, I think it was hard to hold that together in space. And so the experience of having the PS1 expanse to work with, I think led to a place where one could put a bunch of things together and then begin to see how that integration functioned rather than how that permutation worked sequentially. And I think also and maybe Julian, this gets to some of your observations in your text, right? Like that the studio in its blankness as a kind of like white cube space, to me, like I always thought about it as like a spatialized notebook, right? It's like an unruled object at some level. And if, it becomes this kind of like projective, productive reality, then it's like, how do you end up with something that is both blank, but then also becomes kind of like textured and toothsome in some way? Now, so that's about integration, and I think that the disintegration part is that the space, as it stood for a long time, began to feel distant, right? And Fred would say, that the project lasted for 15 years, and it left me with 10,000 square feet to think in. Things could recede, they could go away over slower periods of time. And I very much like the language of being in a place as it relates to having 10,000 square feet to think in, right? And like how spatialized one's thought would be in relationship to the environment. But that by the time of the mid to late 90s, it became something separate. And so, he would say about the permanence of the place. The permanence, once established with the opening of the museum, indeed produced the necessary sense of having some ballast, and designing the interior and the work was a source of great pleasure. But it was a surprise to see how quickly it became something on its own, not necessarily connected to me. Once the work was done, it was done, whereas I had a continuing need to disrupt that permanence that I had wanted. And so I think, and part of that has to do with this body of work that you see, the red relief work, that was a studio-based practice that didn't require the certain type of contingency and on-the-ground work that some of the yarn sculpture did. And so there was, I think, a renewed situatedness that this work presented that then maybe allowed for a plastic engagement that the reality of the museum space had sort of ceased to offer. And so that, to me, is the space of kind of disintegration. And I guess I have two things to say just to sort of button up, and hopefully I'm more or less in time, which is, I think so much of what Fred's work is about and what it has taught me is the difference between what we see and what's actually there. And so there are these beautiful conceptual constructions from the late 60s that are just text-based works. And yet I think they strike at the core of a certain observational impulse that to me really animates and serves as a deep kind of bass note to so much of Fred's work and practice. And there's a part of me that sees in the sort of orange, the intersection of the orange and blue light, there's this fine line, right? And that line to me is an echo of the kind of yarn and linearity that we see in so much of his work, and it's about being on that line where the space of the imperceptible and yet the tangible and the ineffable and the palpable kind of come together. And this is, I think, a way of naming what Fred would say when he says, in no way is my work illusionistic. Illusionistic art refers you away from its factual existence towards something else. My work is full of illusions, but they don't refer to anything. Fact and illusion are equivalents. Trying to weed one out in favor of the other is dealing with an incomplete situation. And just by way of conclusion, I want to offer this observation. So my life and world is one where I end up like throwing images into PowerPoint a lot, and lately, when you put an image in PowerPoint, it gives you like an auto caption, right? This is all like sort of AI generated, or sort of based on computer vision. And so this image, the auto text is a room with a wooden floor and a large glass wall. And so this rehearses a common like sort of plate glass trope that appears in much of the sort of historical literature around Sandback, which feels apt. But I also think that, and I don't want to sort of be too dour about the tech, but one thing that this also suggests to me, right, is a kind of like input-output way of seeing, like a naming something and moving on, like a kind of like CAPTCHA logic that's about isolation and individuation, right? Like there is a thing in this room rather than a paying attention to the complex reality of things and histories existing and not existing at the same time.
Thanks, Andy. That was fascinating. And the litany of thanks is going to get very redundant, and we have limited time, so I'll just say thanks to everyone involved, but really especially to Umberto and Kim for organizing, and to Amy and David, of course, for the invitation to contribute. So I was asked to contribute something to this book about Sandback's relationship to architecture, and I was thrilled about that because he's been an artist who's been very influential on how I think not just about the relationship between art and architecture, but I would say on a more elemental level, really the way I think about space. And as we can revisit in the conversation, as Eddie just said, I think for a lot of people our age, I first encountered the work at Dia Beacon, and this was more than 20 years ago, I still really remember how visceral that encounter was. So basically in my few minutes, what I want to try and do is share two main ideas from my essay. The first one being about what, in fact, his connection to architecture was, and the second one being what that might tell us about his practice. So the first idea is that the point of his connection to architecture is actually drawing, and the idea there is that his work is certainly not representational or illusionistic, as he would tell you, as many art historians have said. But actually, in the field of architecture, neither is drawing, right? It's not really a representational practice in the sense that you're not copying something that exists in the world. You're actually sort of trying to imagine something that you're going to then project into reality. So that makes drawing not a kind of reflection on reality, but really the hinge point between the conceptual and the actual, which I would argue is also, that hinge point is really the crux of Sandback's whole practice. So then when I started to look at his drawings, I noticed two consistent things about them that really seemed unique among his peers, and you can see them both here in a poster for one of his early Dawn Gallery shows. The first is that he used isometric drawing, which is a kind of parallel projection. It's called that because lines do represent depth, just like perspective, but instead of converging like perspective, they stay parallel. And the second was that he consistently drew the entire space. So he shows not just his work, but he shows the gallery context. And what was really interesting to me about that was I couldn't really find that many examples of anyone else doing that, right? So on the one hand, parallel projection is fairly common. You can see here on my left, your right, I guess, we have a Donald Judd piece and below that a Robert Morris piece. They were both his guest professors at Yale. I'm sure he saw drawings like this. And a lot of artists were using parallel projection, but really only to depict individual objects, and usually to kind of pick up on the kind of industrial architectural connotations, let's say, of the technique, but not showing the context. Then on the other hand, about the same time, a few years later, you have a lot of artists like here, Anthony McCall and James Turrell, who are showing the entire gallery space and their work in situ, but they're almost always using perspective. And I would love to think more about that, but for me, I think it's something about this is work that is sort of famously immersive, and it's very invested in the subjectivity of the experience of being in that room with that projection, that light work, et cetera. So I think the kind of embodied perspective of perspective was very conceptually important. At the same time, parallel projection famously had these sort of radical historical connotations, right? It was famously used by people like here we see Liszewski and Theo van Doesburg. I'm confident that Sandback would have seen both of these. These works are both in the collection at Yale, and I did my historical homework, were indeed in that collection while he was a student there. And here what you see is an emphasis on the kind of ambiguity of the technique. So what happens, because the lines don't converge, there's technically no vanishing point, and there's also technically no viewpoint. So you can get a high degree of perceptual ambiguity, which hopefully you see in both of these images, where you can't quite tell if space is kind of popping out towards you or receding back into the page. And I think what's interesting about that is that the technique in art history has become so strongly associated with this kind of work, and also with the work of the so-called neo-avant-garde artists like Judd and Morris, who started using it again in the 60s and 70s, that it's almost thought to be inherently radical, somehow, as if that instability was like a fundamental part of the technique. But of course, I think, as often happens, what this really is this is artists using a technology kind of against the grain to accomplish their ends, because this drawing technique was invented in the 19th century precisely because it was much easier to use than perspective, and also because it was actually better for drawing machines, which at the time were kind of new, right? It was very good for drawing complex three-dimensional interconnections. So an art historian might tell you that an artist using this technique today is some sort of neo-avant-garde, but actually the main people who still use it in everyday practice are plumbers, because if you think about it, they're dealing with very complex three-dimensional networks, right, of interconnections, as you see here. And I would encourage you, if you are a Reddit fan, go to R Plumbing, and you'll see a lot of great drawings like this. So essentially, what I think I took away from all this is the kind of radical equivalency between the work itself and architecture that I think is really unique to Sandback's practice. And to me, that's kind of one takeaway of the isometric technique in the first place. The prefix iso means same, it's called that because the three Cartesian axes are separated by the same angle in the drawing. But I think that's something really special that you don't see in other artists. The work doesn't precede the context, but neither does the context precede the work. They kind of constitute each other, which in a way I think is what you're getting at with the coalescence. And the second, I think the kind of plumber's practicality is also very important, because I think there's a kind of experimentation, pragmatism, but even playfulness. I agree completely about the kind of children's reactions, and obviously we know he himself was very interested in that. So I think, to me, this kind of drawing, it was important because it did have these historical connotations, and it did have, connections to avant-garde practices, but it was also this kind of really pragmatic approach. And I think it was about allowing Sandback to kind of find a space to experiment and play in, and that was a crucial part of it. So in closing, I would just say, what does this mean for actually his relationship to physical architecture in terms of the spaces that he worked in and exhibited in? And I would say, again, this is where I realized he's had a sort of unique position within his peers, I think, in relation to the dreaded white cube. And I think, for me at least, looking back now, there's something very poignant about thinking about how many artists of his generation struggled so hard against the white cube, right? And the endless complaints, it's generic, it's too neutral, etc. But I would argue to my dying day, now we can see the problem was it wasn't just the kind of default context of contemporary art, it was actually part of the system of producing contemporary art, right? So it's not just that contemporary art usually happens to end up in the white cube, it's that when you put something in the white cube, it becomes contemporary art. And that is very hard to fight against. So I think what Sandback did was he used the white cube, he kind of appropriated the white cube and incorporated it into his practice. And I think you see that in these two images, which are two studio spaces he used. So one, you can tell from the bush-hammered concrete at the very top of the frame, that's his undergrad studio at Yale, or excuse me, his grad studio at Yale. And what's fascinating to me about that is, for hopefully many of you have been there, it's Paul Rudolph's Art and Architecture building, which is kind of one of the most notorious, loved and hated brutalist buildings in America. Very hyper-specific, idiosyncratic architectural context, let's say, with a very strong flavor. And of course, Sandback realized all he needed was some sheetrock, and he could just make it I like this notebook space a lot. I'm going to keep thinking about that, And then the other image, which I'm cheating, it's also the studio you showed, Eddie, but it's even from the other corner, so you can't even see the window or the door. So it could be, it could be one of Heiner Friedrich's galleries. It could be the Winchendon Museum. It could be, a Dia space. It really could be anywhere. And I was really fascinated by that, and that's kind of where I closed my essay. I think there's a very powerful lesson there that here's an artist who, has funding from Dia to build his own studio, ground up construction, could have theoretically taken kind of any shape imaginable, and he wants a white rectangle because I think that's actually ultimately the context he knew he was working to, and that was important to him to really incorporate into his practice, not only in the exhibition phase, but in the conception phase. And for what it's worth, I think it was really that foresight that has made his work so valuable and kind of continually vital today. So. Thank you.
Well, as always, when you go last, then it's kind of like trying to not repeat what has been said. But thank you all for these thoughts, and I look forward to the conversation. I guess what we see, my slideshow is going to be on a loop, and we start with the axonometric drawing, actually, of the galleries of Beacon, and now here we are in these photographs that Sandback, we are in Beacon, and these are photographs upon which Sandback drew. And then we'll have a slideshow of Sandback actually preparing the works in Beacon, and we'll conclude with images of the works at Beacon on a loop. While I say a few words, there are 2 points I would like to make in addition to what Eddie and Julian already said, and it's around, of course, bringing us back to the interaction between Dia and Sandback. And one of the questions that, of course, come to mind is then what is the methodology that Dia put in place, and what in particular this did to and for Sandback, or vice versa. What did Sandback's work do to Dia? So to take a step back, as both Jessica and Umberto mentioned, all starts with our co-founder, Heiner Friedrich. There's been, as Umberto was saying, between 68 and 78, 10 exhibitions. Within 10 years, 14 exhibitions that Heiner Friedrich mounted with Sandback, leading to 3 of which at 393 West Broadway in 75, 76, and 78. And those were spaces that the Heiner Friedrich Gallery shared with the Art Foundation, so we consider these within already the work that Dia and Sandback have done together, leading to, in 81, the museum in Winchendon. And this is kind of the first point I wanted to spend a moment. In the first decade of its existence, the Art Foundation worked in a way to support artists and their practice through patronage, offering them space for practice and for showing. So again, the studio that Julian, you were mentioning, that is something that is quite typical. And one of the reasons why I went into the archives is to try and understand all these relationships with artists, and the artists in question would be Dan Flavin, Donald Judd, Walter de Maria, Chamberlain, Lamont Young, and Marian Zazila, and so forth. The relationships were all tailored to the artist. And one of the things that Dia would do would also be to not only, again, thinking at this historical moment when the relationship between studio, gallery, and museum is questioned by many artists, Dia did not decide to open a museum building per se as a repository of a collection where to show art, but rather to engage directly artists and to build spaces with them for their work, and to imagine how they would want to work, and if they wanted to show the work, how they would want to show it. And this is the way, Donald Judd asked to have Marfa, the land in Marfa, purchased, and all these barracks purchased for his work, that, as Julian was saying, very much speaks to this idea of kind of the object in this specific space. And Sandback instead made the decisions that he made. And something that was interesting to me in terms of like, then how does an artist with a stipend, in addition to being offered the space, where to exhibit their work and where to do the work, how do they fashion it? And Julian, you spoke beautifully about that. And the other interesting anecdote from this period to me was also to see how the relationship that Sandback had to actually this stipend. Flavin, for instance, similarly received a similar stipend, but Sandback insisted that he wanted to actually have the stipend in exchange of work. So this is how Dia's collection, which is very deep in terms of holdings was constituted through the fact that the monthly stipend correspond to a monthly sculpture entering the collection, which I thought was very interesting in terms of again, how an artist exists in the world, and we all know that there's different modalities in which recognition and the ballast of the, when I think of the ballast of the museum as the kind of the permanence, sure, but I'm not sure that he was super interested in the permanence per se. I think he had an ambivalence towards permanence, but I think the ballast is also having that monthly recognition that your work is actually being sold and your time is put to that. And then the second moment I wanted to look at is actually instead 2003, which is when, of course, or the years leading to Beacon opening. And if Dia in its first decade had this relationship with a small number of artists to think about a more distributed approach to what it means to exhibit and present, make and present work. So again, as you were saying, this relationship to the space of production and the space of exhibition. Beacon is kind of like bringing that process into one single building, as porous as it is, in which the curatorial method was to invite individual artists to choose a place in this vast post-industrial architecture where to place their work and to choose together which work they would present for these semi-permanent installations. And this is where the conversation in the book converges, because, of course, I wasn't around when all these artists converged to Beacon to install their work. And when I say all these artists, it's Richard Serra, Judd, and Judd actually didn't came himself, but and Sandback, and Curtis Harvey, our colleague, who was the preparator. A preparator was assigned to each artist, and Curtis worked with Sandback. And a few of the questions I asked him was the difference between how Sandback approached the task and the artists of his generation who were also invited. And the biggest difference was, of course, something that I think at this point is a known fact, but that Fred worked alone compared to, and therefore spent a lot of time thinking about the space and his work, rather than, and how to integrate it in, the word you use is, of course, the coalescing or the integration in the space is definitely present in Beacon, and this moment in which you start thinking about the integration of the work in a larger space. That definitely culminates certainly in Beacon. And the conversation with Curtis then revolved around thinking about which is the third point I wanted to make, around how the work then, if we think about this larger question of kind of site specificity as kind of a category that is very general but specific to a number of artists who install their work, and some of the things you already said around what the work is not, and how Sandback himself spoke about his work, how the work is not environmental, again, not imposing, or if we think about Richard Serra, always thought about specificity in terms of the work against the architecture, which is a typical way of approaching site specificity for Serra in this kind of antagonistic mode, is not illusionistic, as you already quoted Sandback. It does not refer to something else that is not there, but its illusions are real facts, as Sandback would say. And not dematerialized is, again, something that Sandback was thinking in relation to the question of ideas and idea and execution being two separate things, and is pushing back in terms of that ideas are the execution, which again speaks to the fact that he would be the one executing the work is not so much kind of an anecdote, but more kind of a mode of pushing back somebody like Lawrence Weiner, where famously is the idea can or cannot be or cannot or might not be executed, but the work exists nevertheless. Whereas the understanding of how it gets to this situational point is something that I hope we can further discuss. And that's it.
Thank you, Matilde, and thank you, Eddie, Julian. I guess I want to start our conversation by thinking about the two elephants in the room, which are, first of all, none of us on stage met Fred, and in a way, we are tasked with the job of representing the work of an artist who's like the second elephant is these relationship that we're speaking about. I'm most certainly predates her birth too. So, we're thinking. I guess my question is, how can we think about an artist and his relevance and his currency and his importance when we're thinking about concepts like situational expense, the social experience of selfhood, the dismantling of architecture, the production of contemporary art, all these elements that we have been discussing in your different presentations. How can we think about Fred now? How can we think about Fred in retrospect? What is it that makes him such a current artist, and what still feels unresolved about the question that he posed that we can think from the now?
Thank you. That is a good question. I think the first elephant, which is to say, I never met Fred, and in doing some of the work that I did, I tried to push really hard on things that weren't situational in a way to understand the situational. There was a long period of time where I spent many days looking at the few artist books that he created that engage with this situational impulse, but do so through a very sort of like concrete and fixed means and parameters as a way to try and like throw that situational structure back and forth. And so that was at least a place where I, as a researcher, found some ballast, to use a term that's been tossed around a little bit. I mean, I come back to the relevance question, elephant too. I think that being in a place, to the degree that there's a critique to be made of some of Fred's work, right, in the space of being so rooted in his own particular practice, right, this sort of like tuning fork relationship to space, right, I think that there's a way that it kind of collapses inward, but I also think there's a way that it is a very generous opening. And I read it as an invitation to community in a variety of ways, and in many instances the kind of like fractures and fragments of community that I think both build relationships and ideally create the spaces that one might aspire to. And in that sense, I see the sort of core of the abstraction that is the center of the work in its animating the space between as the real work that we have to do socioculturally, right? And it's that way of acknowledging the space between that feels like the thing that I carry forward with the work into today that marks its relevance, at least for me.
Yeah, I think on a similar line, I think the work remains incredibly relevant because it's still incredibly impactful. There's some sobriety and clarity in Sandback saying it's a line that I assume is sensed by others. And it's like, okay. And it is so specific in how there's at once the perceptual focus on the line and how the line itself is actually fuzzy. I mean, he comes to use the acrylic yarn because of its incredible specificity to what he wants to achieve. There is always something that is quite, I think, humbling, which I think has a lot to do actually with axonometry and the idea of the decentering of the subject in terms of you can't mirror yourself in the work in a way that is complicated, and it's not really a plane of projection either. And it's very, like, almost like strikingly open, and you have to accept that in a way that is very different to much object-oriented work and image-oriented work in or just culture as we are in now. And the third thing I think has to do with this kind of acceptance that we're talking about the children, both of you, and I've always had some kind of mixed feelings about the Cat's Cradle book for some reason, but I love the fact that the string game is called Cat's Cradle in English. I kind of like, it's such a beautiful, unexpected way of calling this game for some reason. But the way he talks about it is to create space for yourself and maybe someone else. But then, of course, the Cat's Cradle is something that you hold in your hand, but how uncompromisingly open then the work is. And that is quite like talking about letting go, and integration and disintegration is something that you have to accept, that it's hyper-exposed and yet is not there. And I think that is still quite striking, both from an aesthetic standpoint and from a ethical standpoint, I guess.
Both great answers. I'll take a quick stab. I guess first, I just want to point out, this is fascinating to me, and maybe it's the difference between a historian and a curator, but I would have never thought of the fact that I hadn't met Sandback as the elephant in the room. You know, it's kind of interesting. Like, I would have loved to meet him, but in some ways, you know, I think thanks to institutions like DIA and the Sandback Archive being so generous in giving access to materials, you know, there's also something to be said, I think, for being able to let the artist speak to you through their work, and not having, you know, the authority of the author can also be quite complicated. So in some ways, it's almost a privilege, I guess, to engage the work in that way. As far as relevance, I mean, I would kind of return to where I tried to close my remarks about the relationship to the exhibition space, because I think it's true. I mean, when you look at DIA in general, and you think of kind of how small the, you know, Anglo-European American art world at that point, it's almost like mind-boggling how much the art world has expanded. But I think, you know, part of that expansion has obviously been a tremendous expansion of the market as well. And I personally see, you know, exhibition formats as in many ways very market-driven. And so I had this thought when I was, and I try and talk about this a little bit in the book, but, you know, someone like Brian O'Doherty with this sort of famous expose inside the White Cube, you know, all these poor people, they were like, oh, the White Cube is the worst thing that could happen to art. And it's like, you should go to an art fair, you know? And so I called it the White Cubicle, you know, because I think in some ways that's gotten so much worse. Like, on the one hand, sure, the kind of range of cultural practices that we're, you know, in a context like DIA, we're willing to, like, consider as contemporary art has radically expanded. But to me, in terms of what I would almost call like the spatial mechanics of, like, I've got a thing, I need to put it in a room and hopefully sell it, has almost narrowed, you know? And I think that's where I see Sandback as kind of hyper contemporary, like really useful, I think. And I think also in the fact that it's not what we would typically think about as a kind of quote unquote critical approach, like certainly not what I would have learned about in like one of my art history seminars as a critique, and somehow it ended up being, I think, kind of more viable for all that. And then, you know, I would simply say, I won't restate it, but I think there's also some really powerful experiential stuff that both of you are getting to in terms of how one thinks about one's place in the world, subjectivity, et cetera, that, you know, kind of remains timeless almost. But I think for me, it's really it's that relationship to architecture, but not abstract architecture, like architecture for displaying art, that really feels very fresh.
Other aspect of the book that I wanted to discuss with you, and perhaps just to be mindful of time before opening up for the public, I wanted to think that this book both recounts Fred's life and production, as well as his relationship to an institution that's very specific, like DIA, that's very uncommon, that's multi-sided, that has had different permutations and iterations in the past 50 years, that's really unstable in terms of the history. It's not monolithic. It has had different places that have different degrees of permanence. So I'm thinking about exactly that, the relationship between an artist and an institution. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what do you think the role of institutions should be now, and how do you see those relationships shaping artists today?
I mean, I love these. I love that we're getting like right to the core of it. I mean, I guess I'll just be romantic, like more stipends and more studios. You know, I mean, I think that's what's really, to me, kind of breathtaking when you look back on the history of DIA. And of course, you know, those of us who know the history know that that real moment of kind of total freedom, sadly, was directly priced or directly related to a stock price, and so it was actually a pretty narrow window. But yeah, I mean, I just think that's incredible. I mean, I think the more you can do to support artists in that open-ended way, the better. And I do really see that as like the seat of DIA's power. I know, you know, there were complicated personalities and politics involved, of course, but, you know, on a basic level, I think it was a kind of no strings attached creativity grant. And I would love to see more of that. Don't ask me where we're going to get it, but I think that's beautiful.
And just to echo that, I also feel like it's fundamentally about trust, right? Between the way that, you know, it's to the cat's cradle, right? It's like a boundedness that is then also the space of freedom, right? And I think that to the degree that institutions can be incubators and mirror that trust, I think that feels like the thing that is crucial.
No, of course, we think about this all the time, but certainly, yes, the first decade of patronage in this kind of no strings attached, and the level of, as I was saying, the thing that to me was most striking to like wrap my head around is the support of practice and a space for practice and to live in, and a stipend without necessarily the demand to actually show the work. But then how the kind of the push and pull, and what does it mean, of course, if you're an artist, you want to show the work. So I think that is quite interesting. And again, this is a decade that has been romanticized, not only at DIA, but in general, the 70s, and what certain relationship between real estate and practice was made possible by different conditions that definitely we don't have in New York City at the moment. So it's also like the question somehow is like, what are then the conditions today, and what is the support that is viable, but definitely continuing to think about, with costs being so high for fabrication and transportation, and especially at this moment in which it's kind of the triad of circulation between the markets, goods and people, the circulation being so stuck and prevented, then how we think around that, I think that's the priority at the moment.
Also, if DIA has any extra money, I just want to put in a pitch for office space, which is going to be, you know, the 70s, we all know that was about sort of industry and light industry leaving, and now, you know, a lot of white collar jobs may never come back. So
much office space.
Yeah, let's get some.
Still people, well, I wouldn't
give it
say
to some
this
artists
now,
and see what
later
happens.
We can discuss.
Amy MacArthur is the name of our archivist, so thank you, Amy. And I guess we have, just thinking about time, couple of things. We have time for a couple questions, so we would love to hear from you if you have any questions or comments. And also, please don't forget that we do have the book outside, so get your copy because it's beautiful and it has amazing contributions of our author. So yeah, I don't know if anyone has any questions or any comments that.
Thank you for this. Can you talk about his use of color with the yarn?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I'm gonna start, just because an anecdote comes to mind, which in one of his interviews he says that as a good colorist he goes to Kmart. Yes. Walmart. I knew it. I was gonna get this wrong. No, but he went to Walmart, and that's where he would get his ready-made acrylic yarn from various colors. And the other thing I can add is that colors changed every time he would reinstall a piece. Color would change often because, again, of the conditions of the space might be different, as well as the number of threads he would use. And that is very much the case for the installation in Beacon, where works were not specifically made for Beacon, but they were there previously existing, and changing the space, the color changed as well. So,
to embroider on that a little bit, I mean, I think that one way of naming it is just that it was about sort of like weight and timbre in relationship to any sort of specifically articulated situational environment, and so that in X place, if something had been previously like rust brown, then maybe in another context it would be sort of a light blue. There were, colors that he favored, and again, this gets to the weight of like, do you use one thread or three or that kind of thing. There aren't a lot of greens, right? There are certain things that just didn't happen all that often. But I think in many instances it was about how do you sort of like play balance with the space against the kind of like draw that a color might hold. Is I think there's a very sort of like sort of strategic and then tactical relationship to color as a way to animate space.
Thank you all so much. There's a big show up at MoMA right now about textiles and abstraction. Is that a useful frame to think about Sandback?
Well, I think it is because, if I'm not mistaken, that show was curated by Lynn Cook, who was DS curator for many years and that thought about many of these questions and accompanied many of these displays. So I think there is a relationship in which, I don't want to speak for Lynn, but obviously that she has been thinking about threats in space. So maybe you want to add something about that, Matilde, too?
Thinking about the question is a very interesting question. I actually don't know. I mean, I don't think Sandback's work is actually in the show. And I think, however, this brings to mind, I don't know, maybe you want to think about art, Sandback's sculpture in relation to, has either of you seen the show by any chance?
It's on my list for the next couple days, but I haven't seen it.
Definitely worth seeing. Let me think about it. It's a great question, actually.
And I would just say, for what it's worth, so I also have to confess I haven't seen the show, but I think certainly in terms of abstraction, absolutely. I mean, I think that's part of what emerged from this conversation. In different ways, we're all talking about, I think, some of these really powerful things that abstraction can do, right, in terms of awareness of perception, even maybe in terms of social relationships, in terms of models of subjectivity. And, that hasn't been maybe, let's say, like the coolest thing to be making art about super recently. So I think, that's another way maybe that we can see Sandback feeling very relevant. And then I guess the funny thing about considering his work as a textile, I would be interested, you probably thought about this more, but in some ways I feel like the discourse around that is so much in the making, because I believe a textile would by definition be something woven, right? It's an assembly of yarns, and he's just all of his work is spun, I guess technically. It's just an assembly of fibers, so it's if we wanted to periodize it as art historians, it'd be like the proto-textile work or something. But I only mean that just because I think, in a way, to me, that's kind of the brilliance is his work isn't fabricated, right? I mean, I think we're all also kind of responding to that. It's kind of a drawing in space, et cetera, and I think so much of the, at least critical discourse, for better or for worse, about textile is about the weaving and et cetera, et cetera. So,
yeah, and if I can add to that, I think it is related, but it is two different trajectories of modernism. Lynn Cook's show starts with Stepanova and Sonia Delaunay and Anna Hook, and that moment, and of course Annie Albers is kind of the protagonist for half of the show, and then but thinking about essentially the canvas and the grid of the what is this? Now I'm going to butcher. Warp and weft. Is that okay? So thinking about that and looking at the history of modernism and postmodernism through that, through the grid, essentially, and work and image and support being the same thing as it is in textile. And I guess Sandback is another, like the constructivist trajectory, if you wish. But interesting enough, you were talking about like the relevance, and something that I think will maintain it relevant is that it's not mournful. It's not kind of like an end point of modernism, but with the mourning that comes with the end, with the death of modernism. It's actually, interestingly enough, not having that mourning. So I think that's why it is actually so relevant still.
I would add, I mean, to the warp and weft thing, I think if we're in a world that's in a way moving out of the grid, right, then the kind of like present absence of space as an interlacing that is warp and weft through the kind of like installational space, that to me feels like a place where the language bites in a way that then again gets at these trajectories around the sort of long arc of these utopian glimmers that begin in that Russian moment and these types of things. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to compliment the essayists. Julian and Eddie's essays are just beautiful. So there's something about the legacy of an artist that can somehow draw out beautiful writing, which to me is always impressive. So congrats on that. One thing I was thinking about were two things, particularly in relation to Julian's discourse, which is a notion of acupuncture. And it was just occurred to me while looking at these images, which I've seen before, but in terms of the idea of urban acupuncture, spatial acupuncture, and architecture in relation to acupuncture, perhaps thinking about Sandback's work, that's one thing. And the other thing is also thinking about permanence and impermanence as a kind of dialectic, because I grew up looking at Walter de Maria's permanent installations in not white cube, but in proto-loft spaces in a sense, right, in Soho, the Earth Room and Broken Kilometer. So I'm thinking about, there's an interesting dialectic between de Maria and Sandback as well in terms of Dia's support for both artists. So those are just two comments.
Yeah, and the question of visibility and invisibility as well. Right. Yeah.
I've never made that connection, but I really like it because I think in a way that's part of what I was trying to sort of gesture towards in my real like respect for the transformative power of this work, even in a kind of like boring context, let's say like the white cube, because I think that's, you know, I guess that's always the problem one runs into with the kind of artwork or architectural work that aspires to be transformative, right, is the scalability problem. And I think there is something very powerful about how minimal the intervention can be and how sort of amplified the effect is. And I think that, you know, that is in a way what urbanists and architects are looking for at a different scale, right? The idea that if you could just like, if you could sort of do a Sandback, if you could kind of line everything up perfectly, you could have an amplified effect. So I think that's a really actually good way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and I loved your question because acupuncture is a term I think a lot about in curatorial processes, because if you think maybe as an oppositional concept, I think it would be constellations, because you know any and every group can be a constellation, whereas not every group of pressure points is acupuncture, right? So I think that's exactly what Fred work does, and has to do with friction and tension, and how that's activated in the space through these points of pressure that, can again create architecture or dismantle it in reverse. And maybe that's this idea of the tidal movement and oscillation of both creating art, culture, architecture, and dismantling at the same time. It's a beautiful thought for us to end our conversation today. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.